Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Ryan Silverstein back to the program. Ryan, you've been on here before, but there are some people meeting you for the very first time. Take a moment. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Ryan Silverstein. I'm a JD candidate at Villanova University, Charles Widger School of Law, and I'm a fellow with Villanova's McClellan Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy. I write about various issues, including the First Amendment and administrative law in state and local government.
Well, I'm looking at a great article of yours from Real Clear Politics, and I love the theme of this because the title is Higher Education Should Learn from Hillsdale. But as I started into the article, I realized very quickly we're talking a lot about what's been going on with Harvard and the loss of federal funds or the threatened loss of federal funds. Kind of walk us through the process, and then let's talk about what some of these schools facing the loss of federal funding might learn from other schools like Hillsdale.
So what happened, I think this all stems from what happened last spring on a lot of these university campuses like Harvard and Columbia. You had these student groups, I say that with quotation marks. They really weren't students, but, they're activists, whatever. They went into the middle of these college campuses and started protesting. Again, I use that phrase lightly, protesting in quotes, because they really weren't protesting. They were setting up these giant encampments in the middle of these campuses, and then they were using those encampments, which, by the way, were there illegally to harass students who didn't agree with them and to harass Jewish students. Now, what happened is the prior administration, the Biden administration, they were very soft on this. They didn't do anything, which kind of stunned me because you as the federal government have an obligation to enforce federal anti-discrimination law, and they just weren't doing that. So now you have Donald Trump come in, and Donald Trump is notoriously not a friend to the Ivy League. He's not a friend to higher education. He's a friend to one thing, and that's the U.S. Constitution. And he had his Secretary of Education take a look at their funding, and Linda McMahon, she's wonderful. She said, you know what? We're just going to suspend $2 billion in grants for Harvard. They also suspended a lot of grants for Columbia, and Columbia responded by completely capitulating to the Trump administration's demands. And by the way, those demands aren't actually infringing on Columbia's speech. The demands that Trump gave to Columbia, which are the same ones they gave to Harvard, were like, hey, stop breaking civil rights law and stop discriminating in your admissions and hiring processes based on race and religion. Stop discriminating in your admissions process as well. Punish students who actually broke the rules. Don't just let them graduate and stop the proceedings. Actually finish those disciplinary proceedings. Like, this is basic stuff that has nothing to do with the speech itself and has everything to do with making sure policies are actually enforced and that the law is complied with. And I think that's something that's really notable as well, is that if you actually look at Harvard's lawsuit, because Harvard is suing the Trump administration over this, they do make a First Amendment argument, but their First Amendment argument isn't really the cornerstone of their complaint. The cornerstone of their complaint, of their action, is actually administrative law. It's the Administrative Procedure Act. Why? The administrative rule process plays a much bigger role in how funding is dispersed and how funding isn't given instead of the First Amendment. Why? Because they really don't have a big First Amendment claim to stand on. Why? Because it turns out harassment has never, ever been protected by the First Amendment.
It's interesting to me how many of these schools clearly depend on those federal funds. I'd look at Columbia, for instance, how quickly they came back. Okay, no, we can work with this. Obviously, they're afraid of losing that money. But let's talk about those schools that don't take federal funds in the first place. Hillsdale is probably the most notable. There were a couple others you mentioned as well.
I believe I mentioned Hillsdale, Grove City College, and Christendom College in Virginia. They're all solid schools, and unlike these big research institutions that rely on federal funding, these smaller schools, they focus way more on educating their students and producing well-rounded students. And the result, at least for Hillsdale, has been really, really good. I mean, Hillsdale is one of the top 50 liberal arts colleges in the United States. They're a well-known national university. Their graduates are highly regarded, and they're a competitive college to get into. They only have like a 20% acceptance rate.
And they do it all without federal funds. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound facetious, but it just seems like a lot of these universities, especially those that, I don't know, you say Trump is not a friend of the Ivy League. I get the impression maybe the feeling is mutual. Maybe they'd be happier not taking that dirty money from his administration.
Well, yeah, and I mean, this is what stunned me when I read Harvard's letter to the community when they filed their lawsuit. They kind of said something along the lines of, well, no president can direct, no government or president can direct a college and its curriculum. And it's like, well, no, they can, because there's multiple precedents about this. If you're actively violating anti-discrimination law, then you lose federal funding. This is literally what happened to Grove City College in 1984. So this idea that it's such a new thing for the federal government to add conditions to federal funding, it's not new, it's not outrageous. It is a totally normal thing, and statutorily, the federal government is required to enforce federal civil rights law. Like, this is literally required by Congress. It's the president's job to enforce it on college campuses when federal funding is being dispersed. And that's also interesting. If these universities, if they really don't want to be subject to the federal government's interpretation of federal civil rights law, the solution is really simple. Don't take their money. It's not that hard. You just don't want to do it because then you actually have to do things you don't like to do.
The idea there's no such thing as a free lunch, it can't be stated too often. So where does this leave Harvard? Last I had heard, they were willing to do. It sounded like they were willing to make some changes, or at least that's the last thing I'd heard. Has anything changed in that situation?
As far as I know, no. I mean, from what happened is they were willing to make some changes, and then the Trump administration gave them some additional demands, mainly like, hey, ending your DEI curriculum. And that's where Harvard kind of drew the line. And that's kind of crazy if you think about it, that a university is willing to give up billions of dollars in federal funding over DEI curriculum. It's like, really, is it really that important to you? And if it's really that important to a school like Harvard, more likely than not, they're not trying to teach their students. Their goal is to train their students into being activists who have no regard for things like the rule of law, the Constitution, or American culture. And actually, there has been a slight update on this. The Department of Education, like literally last night, Secretary Lyndon McMahon sent a letter to Harvard and said, do not bother applying to any federal grants because you will receive no federal grants.
Wow. Well, I'm grateful to see some accountability finally, starting to go along with those tax dollars. As far as the activism goes, does this play into also, the Title IX controversy we keep hearing about of men or biological males competing in, female sports or being in female, privacy spaces? Does this play into federal funds as well? It seems like the Trump administration has drawn some pretty hard lines with those funds as well.
No, you're right. I mean, universities aren't just, subject to Title VII. They're subject to Title IX. They've been subject to Title IX for over half a century. And already we're seeing the effects of it. The Trump administration just called out the nearby, to me, University of Pennsylvania for a Title IX violation over these trans issues. You had Paula Scanlon go on Twitter and celebrate this victory because she was forced to change in a locker room with a man for 3 years. And that is disgusting. Your personal privacy should not be violated because someone thinks they are another gender. That's not fair.
Interesting. Well, does it portend, is there going to be changes, within these institutions, or is it strictly going to be, the power of the purse from the federal government that maybe shapes some of this change?
I think what's really gonna shape a lot of this change is when Congress finally acts. Because again, this is a Republican Congress, but they really haven't done a lot. They've really been letting Donald Trump use his pen to do a lot of things. Again, as Barack Obama said, I have a phone and a pen. And I think when the Republican Congress finally starts to condition more and more of these funds to university on like Title IX, Title VII, because Congress can do that. They can do whatever they want with appropriation of funds. That's when these universities are really going to have to start shaping up. Mainly because again, a lot of people think university presidents are these like wokey jerks, right? And that's not really what they are. They are career bureaucrats who do what they have to do to survive. That's why in 2020 they did all of this woke stuff because that's what they thought they needed to do to survive. Now they're realizing they pushed it way too far and it's coming back to bite them in the butt. So that's why we're seeing a lot of college presidents resign or move away. And we're seeing a lot of these departments established in 2020 get abolished.
Again, we are talking with Ryan Silverstein. He is a Young Voices contributor. Ryan, where can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, people can follow me on Twitter at Rabbi916, or they can follow me on LinkedIn at Ryan Silverstein.
are back. This is Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Farrell Gregory back to the program. Farrell, for those who are meeting you for the very first time, take a moment, tell us who you are and what you do.
Sure. I'm a fellow at the Foundation for American Innovation, research assistant at the Yorktown Institute, and chief editor of the Emerging Threats Journal here at the University of Oxford.
Very nice. Well, I'll tell you something. When it comes to the relations between Russia and China, there are enough other hot spots and things going on in the world. I don't think I could give an accurate measure of where those two nations are in terms of their relationship with one another. We're going to talk about an article you've written here for The Diplomat. The Sino-Russian alignment stops at Arctic trade. How exactly are Russia and China getting along these days? Can we loosely call them allies? Are they something more, something less?
Sure. So the initial part of the article comes from the idea from 2022, shortly before the invasion in Ukraine, where Russia and China signed so-called no limits partnership. Then about a week later, Russia goes and invades Ukraine, which is an interesting dynamic. So that's kind of been the framework through which Western analysts have viewed the relationship for the past couple of years. But as I argue in the article, Russia and China share a desire to revise the world order, as it's been post 1990s. But I think once you get into the particularities of that next world order as they'd like to see it, their visions actually diverge rather dramatically, not least in their kind of shared geographic area, and perhaps nowhere better than the Arctic, which Russia sees as its exclusive domain, and China wants to use for improved and more secure shipping access.
So let's put this into perspective for people who may fly intercontinentally. All they know about the Arctic is, yes, we flew over it for a long time. It was white down there, but it really seems like a kind of forgotten part of the planet until you start to look at how much shipping traffic actually transits through, that area. Help me to understand, how important is this to the trade of Russia and China? In other words, how much are they currently engaged there in those Arctic areas, and particularly in the shipping lanes?
Yeah, I would say it's obviously somewhere where the trade is expected to grow. There's a Russian estimate that shipping through the Northern Sea Route, which is the sea route through the Arctic, is expected to grow 7 times over 2022 levels, which is a pretty dramatic increase. And it's easy to see why it's a valuable route. Going from essentially Northern Europe to the coast of China, that time, which would otherwise, either go through the Suez Canal, is cut down by 40%. So that is, savings in fuel, that's savings in time. So obviously, it's valuable in that strictly economic sense, but it's also valuable in a security sense, where shipping to and from China right now is subject to certain choke points, like the Strait of Malacca, for instance. And China's undertaken these efforts in Central Asia to diversify its trade routes, particularly over land, which are obviously much more difficult to disrupt. And the particularities of the Northern Sea Route are difficult, not least because of the fact that it goes right past Alaska. But nevertheless, I think that they very much have an interest in diversifying their trade routes. The Arctic is one of those. But for Russia, it's a very, very important location, and increasing the Chinese presence there may just be a bridge too far for them.
I'm curious about the military and scientific significance of the Arctic to either or both of those countries.
Yeah, so I could not say too much about the scientific particulars there. That's where Beijing's presence began, was with some different scientific research vehicles, by investing in scientific labs up there. But when it comes to the military side of things, it's also interesting given its proximity to certain U.S. bases, and the fact that Russia really does have something of a monopoly when it comes to icebreakers. This is another topic that I've written about, where the U.S. barely has two functional icebreakers at this point. Russia has more than 30, and China's closer to us than them, but still also increasing their icebreaker presence. So the military is complicated up there for all sorts of reasons, and as is the scientific.
I'm curious too if this in any way presents something for which the U.S. Needs to feel competitive or would be inclined to feel competitive and like, well, now we need to be in this space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the U.S. is an Arctic nation, by virtue of Alaska. China's not. We have a seat on the Arctic Council. China doesn't. They are an observer nation. So, just based off of geography, we have much more compelling reason to be involved in the Arctic. And given this deficit in icebreakers, which are still an essential part of navigating around the Arctic, I think there is a strong argument for an increased U.S. presence, increased U.S. capability. But something that I also mentioned in the article is that the U.S. Has relatively few pressure points to get at the Russia-China relationship, and instead, I think it's worth taking a look at some of these kind of structural, systematic ways in which the interests of Russia and China diverge. Again, we can't really do much about it, but just given geography, given diverging interests, I think highlighting the Arctic, particularly from that trade perspective, is worthwhile.
Are we looking at? I mean, obviously there's some trade back and forth with China in lieu of in light of these tariffs. Although it sounds like they've come to the table in many ways. Russia has been, in the meantime, kind of the problem child. Lots of sanctions, lots of economic pressure brought to bear. Does playing nice with China, does that help to shield Russia from the consequences or from the sanctions against it? In other words, can it get its needs met through China that those sanctions might otherwise prevent?
I think that's a very interesting question. Since 2022, Russian trade with China has skyrocketed. And when it comes to what Russia's trading, it tends to be, very asymmetric balance. So it's, essentially raw materials and, some, small proportion of it is very advanced military technology, which Russia's previously been unwilling to sell to China, but now doesn't necessarily have a choice. So it's really those two things coming from Russia: discounted raw materials because they can't sell them to the West, and that very advanced military tech. On the other hand, China is kind of flooding Russia with imports in a way and with an effect that is not dissimilar to what's happened to the U.S. in the past. However, the difficulty with Russia, and I think this is another potential breaking point, one that I didn't really touch on too much in this article, but I think is very much worthwhile to discuss, is this trade tension. Because the longer that Russia doesn't have any options besides China, the more that relationship becomes costly, and the greater threat that poses for Russia when their only option for selling and buying essential goods is China, which as I demonstrate here in the Arctic, has diverging interests in the near term with Russia.
Are there any other countries? I mean, I guess I would assume that they'd pretty much want to touch the Arctic region to be able to assert any kind of interest in there. But then again, I mean, nations like India or others that are competing for resources that might be available. Do you have any others that express interest or that might also want a crack at that region?
Yeah, it's interesting. You're right to note that a lot of it is down to geography, and a number of those other Arctic Council countries are allies, like Denmark, like Sweden, like Finland. So we don't have so much concern there. No, I'd say it is pretty secure as far as the place goes, except the three main players are the U.S., Russia, and increasingly China. It's really a matter of great power competition, who has the resources to field boats and positions in the Arctic, which is already not too hospitable in the first place.
Once again, we have been visiting with Farrell Gregory. Farrell, where can people follow you online or on social media?
Sure. My X is at Farrell Gregory, Farrell Gregory.
Recording in progress.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome back to the show Nate Phipps. Nate, you've been on here multiple times, but I'm sure for some people, they're meeting you for the very first time. Take a moment to tell us about what you do.
Yeah, so I'm an independent commenter and journalist, and I write a lot on Israel-Palestine and the fallout from October 7th and the relationship that has with civil liberties. I think since then, we've seen a lot of complicated conversations around freedom of speech, property rights, and other stuff that impact our freedoms here in the US. And I think that there have been some people who've had good things to say, but I think some people have had a lot of black and white conversations, and I'm really trying to bring the good from multiple different perspectives and bring it to the table to try to figure out a better path forward.
Okay, I'm looking at an article from The Spectator, an article you wrote about how pro-Palestine is a cover for anti-American. And look, I have to admit, I've not been to any of the protests on the nation's college campuses, but when I hear, pro-Palestinian protesters were out, my first thought is, I wonder if it got violent, because it's just seems like there is potential for violence that seems to follow each of these demonstrations. And I know that's painting with a very broad brush, but it seems like some of the people who take advantage of these demonstrations may not actually be operating in the interest of the Palestinians so much as some other agenda that they hope to go out and beat the drum for.
Yeah, I actually didn't pick that title. I probably would have gone with something slightly different if I had my say in it. But I do think that there is a cause for concern that a lot of the people who lead these charitable organizations that represent the pro-Palestine movement are pushing out very anti-American messaging, such as bring the war home, bring the Intifada home, referring to the war against Israel in the Middle East. And so I don't know how cynical you have to be to where you actually say, I want to bring that violence that's going on in the Holy Land. I want to replicate that here in the US. And at a certain point, we have to say there's a problem here. And this does not represent the regular Palestinian person who just wants to live in peace. I actually think this is detrimental for their well-being.
Yeah, I know that there are people who legitimately are concerned for the Palestinians, but it just seems like what are they using to get these protesters out if people don't even know what they're protesting?
So I think, they're taking advantage of people's compassion, and this has really become the flashpoint issue. There's lots of conflicts all over the world who just don't get the same attention. And there's various provocateurs on social media who will say, when I am on my deathbed, I want my kids and grandkids to know I spoke up for Palestine. My point is, I think that when our loved ones die, we're not going to ask them about how they stood on ethnic conflicts from decades prior. I mean, all of that is important, but at a certain point, it's just grandstanding.
Well, and as you had mentioned, it's like some of the people who are participating in these, it seems like whatever's happening with Palestine or with the Palestinians is really secondary to, we are here to disrupt, we're here to take over, we're here to intimidate. I don't know. I don't get the impression that it's grassroots. And let's talk a little bit about some of the nonprofit groups that have helped to fund these. Are there familiar names that people would recognize, or are these mostly, nondescript NGOs that you wouldn't merit a second glance?
If you're someone who pays attention to this conflict, like you're really in the weeds, you might, but a lot of them, no, probably not. A lot of them are campus organizations that may or may not actually be run by students. A lot of them probably receive money from Qatar. And so these are not necessarily recognizable organizations, but they do have a big influence. I mean, the report from Capital Research Center really went into a lot of their messaging on social media, and they're having an outsized impact. I think they're actually, strategically speaking, kind of clever for not being so mainstream. They're able to push activists who have a face. And I think, from the far left, we've seen them do a lot with messaging. And I think we see that here as well. So
have the protests themselves calmed down? I know the nicer weather's getting here. Winter that's likely to keep people from protesting, outside. Maybe that's a thing of the past. Are we seeing similar outcry to what we saw last year on the nation's campuses, or has that dissipated?
I was just at the Capitol near the Supreme Court, and I saw a pro-Palestine protest where they were all dressed up in their masks, and they were carrying signs, and one said, the United States of America, and then had America crossed out and said Israel underneath. And I think that's kind of ironic given this sort of messaging that we're seeing from the Capitol Research Center, to where they're trying to say, hey, Israel is America's enemy, whereas their messaging shows they seem to really want to question America's right to exist, much like they have done the same with Israel. And I think they've played their hand and they've gone too far. And I think there's going to be a pushback.
I mean, I know that the John Birch Society would probably nod in vigorous agreement if I were to say, this just classic, Marxist subversion that's coming along. But I have to wonder if, the pattern has been pretty much the same historically. Find, a cause, especially where there's oppressors versus oppressed. And it seems like you can really sway a lot of people into chanting in unison, to advance what I would term more left-wing ideologies.
Yeah, and you saw that, very early on in the conflict years ago. Stalin actually initially sided with Israel, then very quickly flip-flopped and wanted to support the Arab cause. And very early on, there was a lot of Marxist sentiment that went into the conflict. And I know that kind of today the term Marxist feels a little alarmism, but I think in this case it's warranted. I think there is a lot of concern to where there's a lot of far left political ideology that's behind the pro-Palestine cause, and they'll use the term colonialism a lot. And I don't think it's a tactful way to think through how the empires of old have negatively impacted marginalized people. That's a conversation we absolutely should have. But it's moved beyond that into a point to where it's dehumanizing people. Colonial has become a new word, a dog whistle for people that I don't like politically.
No, I think you nailed it. And I hear it applied in everything. I mean, the India, Pakistan, conflict. Well, that's a relic of back when the Brits, controlled it. We're down to about 1 minute left here before we've got to wrap things up. What would you like our audience to take away from this discussion when they see news about protests on campus, when they see pro-Palestinian protests going on? What are the kind of things they need to be aware of?
I think it's really important to be critical whenever you come to this conflict. And I think that if you want to have a positive principled effect, you need to be prepared to criticize your own side. Maybe not as much, but if you really want the other side to behave better, criticize your own side and show the example, be principled, and center on human dignity for all involved.
Beautifully said. I hope people will be taking notes. Again, we are talking with Nathaniel Phipps. I call him Nate, but thank you again so much for being on the show. Where can people find you on social media? Where can they follow you?
So I'm not actually super active on social media. If you Google Aviv Nathaniel Phipps, that's my writing name. It's actually pretty great for SEO. All my articles pop up.
Okay. Well, I look forward to our next conversation. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment today for Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Sam Raus back to the program. Sam, take a moment here for the sake of those meeting you for the first time and tell us just a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name is Sam Raus. I am a writer with Young Voices. I have been now for over a year, and I'm from originally outside of the Philadelphia area, and I've particularly been focused on some issues regarding tech and financial related policy, but have also now started to wade into some of the cultural news and developments happening, particularly in the online sphere, but more generally in art, pop culture, social media, and kind of how all these things tie together and what the world is like these days and how things may look in the future.
No, I'm glad that you're doing that. And to me, the fact that you have the credentials, you've been a serious, data driven writer, but let me humor me on this. Why is it important that people have some cultural literacy and know what's going on with the popular culture, as well as just, the facts and, the data of their world? Why does our culture matter?
Yeah, I think that for me, it always has tied back to being a big consumer of entertainment. I think that there's so many life lessons to be learned, so many ways to work through points in your life where you don't understand what's going on. Maybe it's, how other people are behaving or why challenges are arising in your life that you haven't dealt with before now arising. And I think that music and movies and classical art, whatever floats your boat, can offer a lot of guidance on that, both from just a practical side of things. I think like everyone's got a movie that's they say completely shaped how they look at different things, how they approach certain things. But even from a more serious side, I think there's a lot of questions around morality, a lot of questions around culture and the advancement of our society, issues with human rights and religion and things over time that we see depicted most commonly in media. People are much more familiar with media representations of things and how media has changed people than they are really with our laws or our data. And people in 25, 30, 50 years from now will remember the cultural artifacts of our time, not maybe necessarily some Pew study or a comment on a piece of policy. So I think it's important to look at how much culture is the first thing that changes, and a lot of this other stuff is downstream effects of that.
So let's talk about Lady Gaga, because when it comes to popular culture, that is a young woman who has definitely left her mark. You've got an article here in realclearbooks.com about Lady Gaga's Mayhem album and also the art of pop nonconformity. Where do we begin?
Yeah, I think I've been a longtime fan since my childhood. I really came up with Gaga and some of the artists in that class in their 2010s and now 2020s. Um, I think it's really interesting seeing some of these acts that are now for our generation, and I'm on the older side of Gen Z, becoming a legacy act. It's becoming not maybe the absolute zeitgeist of today trending on TikTok, but what was the advent of social media? What was the advent of the iPhone and iTunes and all, the online app store? Artists really start to explore their artistic roots and understand why they became so famous in the first place. And Gaga is one of the greatest examples of one of these true international superstars that has really shifted the game in terms of music videos, fashion. She's done a lot. She is definitely somebody that applies a lot of traditional artwork and music styles to modern pop music. And what we're seeing right now from her and a lot of different artists is, I think, something that we saw when they first started their careers in the 2010s, which is, yeah, this fusion of different styles, this kind of messiness that doesn't allow itself to be so strung down by what has been a lot of radio friendly music that people argue, it sounds all the same. Now we're getting back to, whoa, the radio is really changing it up song by song. I keep altering the station because it's so different in the different types of moods that it's appealing to, genres that it's appealing to. And it's a really interesting moment that we're seeing across pop culture right now.
I'm curious, you mentioned that Lady Gaga's album 5 years ago was delayed because of the pandemic response. Did she or other artists have to kind of reinvent themselves, coming forward from that point? It seems like that could have been a very interesting pivot point for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think COVID was a paradigm shift for society in general, and we definitely saw that in terms of music, in terms of movies. We had a period of time where artists couldn't advertise themselves in the same kind of way, do the same kind of events, some even recording, though I think a lot of them kind of went into hiding and worked really heavily on what is now their latest music. And we saw that with really the explosion of Taylor Swift's success with her two more indie folk kind of albums. And then we saw that a lot with movies and television, as there was not just delays from the COVID pandemic, but also delays from the writer's strike, and some other changes in their industry. And so we're seeing, I think, the first real return to big budget, major successes in this industry, in these industries in entertainment that we haven't seen for yet almost half a decade now because of the lingering fallout of COVID, just shifting timelines. I mean, a movie or an album cycle doesn't come together in a couple of weeks. It takes over a year to plan, to record, to edit. And so when things get delayed in the sectors, it takes a long time until we see the after effects of that.
And I know this is kind of an unfair question, but I have to ask this. After seeing Madonna still out there, you know, in her 60s and on stage, and still very talented individual, does there come a point of diminishing returns? I mean, it's from the article that you've written, it sounds like Lady Gaga still very much in her prime, very relevant. She's punching all the right buttons. Now, this is a subjective call, but when I see video of Madonna doing whatever it is she's doing, I kind of think there's a time for gracefully, you know, bowing out.
I think, yeah, one of the interesting things with Gaga and people like Taylor Swift's continued evolution is artists, particularly I think for our generation, people are always looking for something new and something different. And so those that are willing to change up their genre, I think a lot of artists of our generation are aging nicely, not just literally they can, you know, now get GOP1s and such, but they're quite literally tr maturing and collecting a new sound. But yeah, we've seen Katy Perry, one of Taylor Swift and Gaga's greatest rivals, kind of have a falling out because she has not adapted her sound, not adapted her style, even though she's now in her 40s. And then yeah, I think um, Madonna, there's just interesting examples of people, I think later on maybe want a softer sound, a more stripped back sound, calmer music, and that's really one of Gaga's strength points with her whole collaborative works with Tony Bennett at the end of his life. She's able to transcend the pop trendy zeitgeist with the classics and you know things that really appeal to an Academy audience, you know, a really musical audience that's classically trained.
Okay, I'll admit I've not been an aficionado of Lady Gaga's music, but you got me interested in her as an artist just because of what she's been able to pull together. I mean, not just her music, but the whole persona. She's definitely shaped pop culture, hasn't she?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see some artists stand out. And I mean, she takes political stances. She's taken a big role in certain social causes. How different those people can be from those that maybe just keep pushing out hits that are very successful, but we don't really know who they are as a person and where they fall on things.
Again, we are talking with Sam Raus. He is a Young Voices Consumer Freedom Fellow. Where can people find you on social media, Sam?
Yeah, they can find me on X at Sam Rouse1. I've